And we are making great strides through our agenda today. And it brings me great pleasure now to be introducing the next speaker, the leader of For Humanity. And many of you will know this brilliant person, which I'm going to put on stage so that we can see you, Ryan. So Ryan, welcome, welcome. Let me introduce you. You are the founder and volunteer executive director of For Humanity. I know that many people who are in the MKAI community are also present in your work. Some are even, I think, fellows or hoping to become fellows. We are cheerleaders, supporters, fans of everything that you do, and very much, glad to support it. So in terms of you, you founded For Humanity after a 25-year career in finance with global business experience, risk management expertise, and a unique perspective on how to manage the risk, which led you to launch and fund this non-profit entity. So Ryan is focused on the independent audit of AI systems as one means, but a very important means, to mitigate the risk associated with artificial intelligence, and as such began to build a trust model associated with the first of its kind process for auditing AIs, using a globally crowdsourced process to determine the best practices. I'll say again, he serves as For Humanity's executive director and chairman of the board of directors. He's responsible for the day-to-day functionality of For Humanity and the overall curation of the independent audit. I see amazing announcements coming out all the time, Ryan, from your organization. I'm very, very glad you're doing the work that you're doing. I'm very glad that you're here. It's very much your space, your time. I'll say thank you again for being here, and the stage is yours.
My pleasure. It is a great honor to talk to this community. As Richard just said, our communities are aligned. And so it has been wonderful to see people from MKAI coming into For Humanity, and For Humanity people heading into MKAI, because we are doing similar work, or our hearts are aligned. And to me, that's the most important thing. So as we talk about bias, we actually have to start with independent audit of AI systems. Why? Because anything that I'm going to say about bias is going to be a function of independent audit of AI systems. That's the how, or how we tackle these issues around bias. Now, before I even start with that, though, I want to manage the words we use. Eliminate bias is not a goal. It's not a target. It shouldn't be. It's a lovely ideal, but it can't be more than an ideal. There is so much inherent bias in who we are as human beings, it can't be eliminated. The math of the term bias also tells us it is impossible to eliminate it. And therefore, we want to use a very important word, which is mitigate bias. That should be our goal, but it also should be our mantra. Because when we are mitigating bias, what we are doing is recognizing that it will always be there, and that this is work we always have to do to make sure we're best reducing the risk of the impact of bias. Now, in independent audit of AI systems, this is our primary process for managing the risks from AI to humans. Our entire mission is to mitigate risks we refer to them as downside risks, from AI and autonomous systems to humans, to get a better result from all these systems. It's not anti-technology. We're totally cool with the technology as long as we can mitigate these big risks. The 5 areas that we focus on are ethics, bias, notice it's a whole area unto itself, privacy, trust, and cybersecurity. And the reason that we want to put this system in place is to solve the how question. Simon and Ati all made excellent points about identifying where the issues lie, or even taking steps to remedy these issues. Here's the problem. Until they are required and people are accountable for it, their jobs are on the line, their businesses are on the line, or even legally, their lawfulness is on the line. A lot of times it's going to be talk, because this is a difficult thing to do. And so the nature of independent audit of AI systems creates an accountability, governance, oversight infrastructure that demands reporting requirements into organizations, committees, typically Algorithmic Risk Committee, Children's Data Oversight Committee, and a standing and responsible, coordinated, organized, and reporting into the CEO Ethics Committee, which is going to be important to my talk, which is why I'm kind of highlighting. These bodies are responsible for owning this risk, mitigating this risk, documenting this risk. And you'll see why documentation is important too by the time I finish. All of this reports into the CEO because the CEO is responsible for the mitigation of bias. Let's take a specific example for a second. In the United States, the EEOC is responsible for governing equal employment opportunity. And it's based on the Civil Rights Act. And they have determinations of what is fair. It's one of the few quantitative measures of fairness in the world. It's called the 4/5 rule. 4/5 rule basically says that whatever my highest selection rate of hiring is, typically white males, but you just use that as an example, right? All my protected category variables must be within 4/5 of that ratio. Now, you can be under, you can be over. There's statistical reasons. There's just even opportunity reasons. There's small sample size reasons why you might be over, under, around. But the point is this is a measure of fairness that requires justification. And it's one of the ways that bias, which is illegal in employment and hiring in the United States, is tackled. So as we go to deploy the tests, the solutions, the inputs, the audit criteria to figure out how to manage where these risks come from, we want to think of it from that legalistic government responsibility or government law, but also CEO responsibility of having to to mitigate risk from bias, okay? Bias can come in we characterize it in 3 different places. I put a paper in, which is kind of the background of the rest of this talk, that focuses on bias in data sets. We think of bias in 3 places. Bias can come in at the data set level, at the architectural input level, and at the outcome level, usually in the form of adverse impact or disparate impact, however you want to define that. The paper focuses only on data. Data is the representation of people into these AIs and autonomous systems. And there are so many ways that data can become, or data can bring bias with it into the equation from the beginning. And so what we want to do is we want to create auditable rules. Simon mentioned this already. He said auditable AIs or auditable systems to try to tackle the bias issue. We agree completely. But let me tell you what auditable means. It doesn't mean some teams inside of an entity looking at the design and development of another team. That is not auditable. Auditable means 3 very precious things. It's done by outside certified practitioners. Remember, we've been doing audits for 50 years. We've just been doing them in finance. As we bring them over to AI and autonomous systems, we have to remember these words aren't new. Audit has very particular special meaning. So the first one is audits are done by certified practitioners and they're independent of the entity. Number 2, they have to be an independent set of rules to govern what is being audited. In other words, the auditor can't come into the equation and say, I will audit you on my rules. It doesn't work. It's an inherent conflict of interest, and there's insufficient objectivity on what those audit rules look like. And then the third thing is that an auditor must be totally independent, and they do their work actually over a target of evaluation on behalf of the public. And this creates a very important tension between the auditor and the entity. The law of independence applies here. So an auditor cannot get any remunerations from the auditee other than the fees associated with their audits. They can't do strategy, software installations, guidance, compliance, pre-audit. They can't do anything. So no upside potential, and they have to wear downside risk. And that downside risk comes from if they assure compliance that is not there. So if Richard was the auditee and I'm his auditor, and we've been working together for years, we have a great working relationship. We get lunch every time afterwards. And I walk in and I say, Richard, have you built the algorithmic risk committee? And he says, yeah, Sally, Susie, Joe, and Jimmy are all on the committee with me. And I smile. I know he's telling me the truth. But as his auditor, I got to lean in and I got to say, Richard, you know, you got to prove it to me. You got to show me the meeting minutes. You have to show me the roster. You have to show me how the algorithmic risk committee impacted the system. Why? Because I don't work for him. I work for the public, and the public relies on me as the auditor to assure that he is compliant. And I get in trouble if I've assured compliance, it's not there. So the auditor requires proof. Why do I tell you all of this backstory? Because when we talk about auditability, we have to have and set up binary rules. We have to have the ability for every single audit criteria that the auditor is going to assess in bias has to be a binary set of rules. Why? Because if I'm sitting there wondering if someone is compliant with an audit rule, if I'm wondering, what am I going to say? Not compliant. I have to, because otherwise my risk is on the line and I cannot defend my position. So creating binary rules in a way that allows the auditor to say compliant or not compliant is necessary at the audit level. You know what doesn't create audit rules? Standards, guidelines, frameworks, laws, best practices. So if you want to know what For Humanity does, we practice an art of taking all of those things and crafting them into binary rules. And when we do that in bias, we have a whole set of requirements we need on data quality, labeling, data representativeness, and so on that I'm going to get into in a moment. Now, it might sound like we think we're pretty cool at For Humanity. We are a charity. We are a nonprofit. Every single person is a volunteer. We are now 425 people from 45 countries around the world and growing. And so what we do is a service. We practice this art, this crafting of all these laws, best practices, guidelines, frameworks. We turn it into auditable rules and we submit it to governments, we submit it to regulators, and we say, here, is this what you meant? When they say, nope, we go back and do our work and we come back and we say, here, is this what you meant? And when they finally say yes, then we license this to auditors, pre-audit service providers all around the world who will now do the work in bias. And so now with that background, knowing what auditable means, and most importantly, how audit will change and mitigate bias. That's the basis of what I've covered so far. So now let's talk about bias, okay? When we talk about bias, we want to talk about it in a couple of different places. And Ati brought up one, and I want to talk about that one first, which is diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback. Now, the world's been pretty good historically at doing this on outcomes. They're called focus groups. We get a bunch of people together. Maybe they're diverse, maybe they're not, maybe they're multi-stakeholder, maybe they're not, but we at least have a process for assessing outcomes and kind of saying, did we do good, right? That companies are very used to this process. Here's the problem. Sunk cost bias and confirmation bias, which was actually mentioned in the video. She used the term validity bias, confirmation bias, same thing, okay? Those things are massive in the design and development process. And if you wait until outcomes to assess risk to multi-stakeholders, you're done. It's too late. So what independent audit of AI systems, what our audit rules require, even in our GDPR certification, which is with the ICO today, okay? We require diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback at the design and development phase to assess risk. And this is hugely important to cut off problems before they happen in that design and development phase, to manage this process before it's gone too far, but most importantly, to provide human agency into this process. Diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback is external viewpoints on how this algorithm, this solution, this AI is being built. Now, we use the word diverse inputs. When is diverse satisfied? Do we want to leave that decision up to the designers and developers? Absolutely not. They don't have objectivity on this matter. So this is where we come to this ethics committee. And what we do is we require, we found that all through the design and development phase, and let me just run it through for you real quick: necessity, proportionality, reliability, validity, KPI design around concept drift, dealing with soft law requirements, dealing with benchmarking, all of these issues typically handled by the design and development team are filled with instances of ethical choice. Engineers who were given a problem, solve this problem. That's what they're great at. We celebrate them for that. But all through this process, they're making instances of ethical choice along the way. And they're not even aware of it, and they're certainly not trained for it. So what we want to do, what the audit process does, is it extracts these instances of ethical choice. It looks around the organization and it basically said, who's the most objective part of the organization to handle these key and challenging issues? And the answer was a standing and responsible ethics committee trained in algorithm ethics. And so they're the ones, when we look at diverse input and multi-stakeholder feedback process, they're the ones who will determine if the groups that we have in place are sufficiently diverse to provide this input and this risk assessment. So that's just one example of how we aim to mitigate bias. This is in the design and development, and most importantly, the risk assessment and impact phase of the process. Now let's talk about bias in data sets. When we talk about bias in data sets, there are so many places and biases that can come in. Sample bias, non-response bias, cognitive bias. Let me tackle non-response bias first. The inputs for this are often technological. And by being technological, there are certain groups, it could be the poor, it could be the disassociated, it could be the disconnected, it could be the elderly, who are naturally disconnected from the ability to participate in these processes. That's bias right from the get-go. That's bias right at the technological level, right at the interface with the process, okay? So that is something that must be considered in the process. And for example, we ask and demand of the Algorithmic Risk Committee that they consider this, that they document what they're doing about it, what they're examining about it, and what they establish as mitigations. Cognitive bias. This is a huge problem. There are over 300 cognitive biases by some measures. There are not quantitative, there are not technical measures yet today to tackle this. And so again, what we want to do is we want to put it in the hands of the Algorithmic Risk Committee, in the hands of the Ethics Committee, to basically say, think about what you're doing. Take some time to talk about it. Document that conversation. Document the places that you're concerned about cognitive bias, and then take steps to mitigate the risk. This will improve and grow over time. People will develop tools and systems to help enumerate this process better. It's not even here today. So I think this is one place where we'll see developments over time. So I want to set those two aside, non-response bias and cognitive bias. And now I want to focus on the data. So in the data, we have a ton of problems. First off, we can have straight up sample bias. Our training set doesn't look like our broad community, our testing and validation set, okay? Simple disagreements of statistical characteristics, we have to ensure that that does not happen. So the audit requires that. The audit requires the documentation of that. Just tackling sample bias at the beginning. But let's talk about benchmarking and representativeness for a second. Let's say I want to hire a new graduate in computer science, and I want to look at gender bias for a second. What's a fair benchmark to compare this against? I can start with 51-49, that's the share of women to men in the world, and maybe that should be my benchmark. That's gender, you know, if I'm apart from that, am I biased? The answer is by definition, yes, okay? And that also tells you why it's impossible to perfectly match up to our benchmarks. But here's the thing, I'm going to give you another reasonable benchmark. Remember, I'm hiring, so I have a job to do, an undergraduate with a computer science degree. You know what the ratio of men to women is currently today in computer science degree graduates? 82 to 18. Is that a reasonable benchmark for me to use? Yes, it is, because it reflects the universe of which I'm trying to pull from. At the same time, I am going to equally tell you it was reasonable and it's biased. Why is it biased? Well, of course it's biased because we know that there are whole systemic reasons in our system why more men go get computer science degrees than women. And there's huge efforts to try to rectify that. And they're fantastic. So it's a reasonable benchmark, but it's also biased. And now I have this ethical choice problem of what should my benchmark be for representativeness of women in my data set, and how do I rectify that? Let me throw one more thing in the mix. 82-18 is today's distribution between men and women. What was it 2 years ago? It's about 16% to 84. So now we have a trend line, right? If I do 82-18, am I behind the trend? If I'm socially responsible, if I'm trying to mitigate bias, if I'm building a benchmark that improves our standing, my standing, this company's standing vis-a-vis this particular question of gender bias, maybe my ratio shouldn't be 18 to 82, maybe it should be 20 to 80. Maybe that's a reasonable sort of bottom line benchmark because I know the direction the trend line's hitting. Here's the point. All of these are ethical choices. What we are benchmarking around when we stop mitigating bias by trying to introduce adjustments to our data set to mitigate bias, the choice that we make on setting that benchmark is an ethical choice. Now, let's take the other end of the spectrum. 51-49, male, female. What if I did an entire database of women? Is that bias? Yeah, I've actually introduced reverse bias or reverse discrimination or affirmative action or however you want to describe it. I've gone too far. And so figuring out what is an appropriate place, not a perfect place, not an elimination of bias, but an acceptable place in which data representativeness is executed is an ethical choice. And you know who shouldn't make it? Designers and developers who are embedded in the system. The objective, accountable governance role needs to happen from outside, and they need to say effectively, yes, you're cool. Now, let me take that one step further in terms of how audit will effectuate what we call a virtuous circle of feedback. All of these decisions, and there's many more, I won't go into them now. I've talked way too long. I'm boring you all to death. I'm 100% certain of that. But as all of these decisions are made across the process, what we are going to ask entities to do is not only are they going to have to put in place bias mitigations all throughout the process, mitigations around labeling, mitigations around data quality, mitigations around benchmarking, okay? But now they're going to have to disclose these in what we call a data disclosure document, which will talk about residual risk from bias, which will talk about the decisions that they made to try to mitigate bias, show those risk mitigations, and you know what? It's going to do it publicly. Now, what happens when you do it publicly? First off, it's required by the audit. Ideally, it would be required by law over time. The EU Artificial Intelligence Act demands data representativeness. So it's highly likely that when that is passed, these issues of data quality, labeling, representativeness, bias mitigation will become law, at least as it affirms the artificial intelligence covered by the law. It will pass. The question is, what's the forum going to look like in the end? So now what we will require through that is, here are the disclosures. And why is this a virtuous feedback loop? Because the company is actually, in this case, when they're following the rules, when they're following the law, they're trying to get it right. They're going to put out there, here's what we're doing. And good and responsible citizens will then feed back on those disclosures and kind of make some arguments. Oh, you use 1882 as your benchmark for gender, for deciding if you needed to mitigate that some more, and you didn't follow the trend line. Maybe you could be more aggressive next time. Maybe you could support this mission. And there's lots of other ways that these data disclosures will allow for a positive, virtuous feedback loop where the company can learn societal views on this. Academics will come in and say, we've done research on fairness, and it looks like this. And people will learn and grow and advance. The nature of what we're trying to build in independent audit of AI systems it's over my head. And I'm sorry to be a little bit, advertising, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, accountability and trust powered by governance and oversight. Building this infrastructure in place so that it actually happens. And we stop just talking about it and putting pretty words around it and maybe occasionally trying to tackle these problems when good people try to do good things. And now we're demanding it. Now we're requiring it. Now we're ensuring that the work that gets done is in the best interest of people through these auditable rules. Talked a lot. Hope it wasn't too much, Richard. I hope it was informative. I hope you all will feedback on better ways to do this. As Richard mentioned, this whole process is crowdsourced. This whole process is a place where each one of you can come to have a place to have your voice heard on these subjects. And there's a number of people in this room who I hope will sort of tell you that that's true. So I guess I'm going back to Jaisal. So thank you, Jaisal, and thank you all for this time and letting me talk your ears off.
Thanks, Ryan. I think I'm just mesmerized with the talk, and there's so much information, the kind of work that you have been doing, the pillars that you have been working. I think I'm involved along with Vibhav as well. The pillars that you have introduced. I think it would be really unfair to summarize in few words, but I would still go ahead and do it. Thanks for introducing us to the various kinds of bias that could come into any of the systems, and how people need to look at the various levels at which bias can come in. It could be architecture, it could be the outcomes, it is the data sets itself. What are the personas that could be involved in creating these biases, and how audit systems are going to be helping in order to build the systems which have less bias, and also I think the feedback system, which you mentioned, the data disclosure, how documentation is also going to be helping to reduce the risks, to own the risks, and to mitigate the risks as a whole is very, very important, I think, as a whole. And the various sample data issue or the benchmarking issue that you highlighted, I think it is so important. And as you indicated, that data set actually is a representation of people and what is auditable AI. I think these are the points that people need to really think upon, that having an independent auditor, a third party certified professional or a practitioner, and having the binary rules, independent rules, and having the proofs or evidence of what these AI systems need to present so that the audit is successful is the way forward to mitigate the risks and the biases in the systems. Thank you. And I move on to Richard, and then we can start the panel discussion. Richard, over to you if you want to say any few words, and then we can move to panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Jaisal. Just a quick thanks from myself, Iran, and of course for Simon as well, who spoke before that, and Ati as well. So informative, and thank you for bringing these ideas. I think, we all find our place in this ecosystem, and we all develop our place as well. And MKAI, I think we're a catalyzing force, we're an energizing force, we're a communicative force. But what we want is for people to come into this community and for the sum of the parts to be greater than the whole. And that means that, we're so pleased to point people towards Ryan and For Humanity. That is a place you can make an impact right now in this world and the challenges that we have. And we are very pleased to be in that sort of navigation role and supporting organizations like yours, Ryan.